May I proceed?
Yes, please.
Could you introduce yourself to the court?
Good morning. My name is Dr. Patrick Sikorsky. I'm the director of the Criminalistics Laboratory in the state of Midlands.
What kind of an educational background do you have to hold that position?
Well, I have a dual PhD in chemistry and biology, but the more relevant part of my education is the fact that I actually worked in this laboratory for about 10 years before I became the director of it.
So why are you here today in court?
Well, I'm here because I was actually in the laboratory on the day that the briefcase was brought in that was found on Mr. Covington when he was arrested.
And what date was Mr. Covington arrested?
That was April 19th.
So once you got this briefcase, what kind of analysis did you run on this briefcase?
Well, I ran my standard battery of forensic tests, and there were three that I really focused on. The first was magnetic fingerprint analysis. The second was to analyze the inside of the briefcase and find whatever evidence I could in there. And finally, there was a small fragrance stain on the bottom of the briefcase that I noticed, and I tested that to try to figure out what it was as well.
So I'd like to talk about each of those tests. But first, were you able to find enough evidence in this case to run each of those tests?
Yes, I was. Each of my conclusions in my report is based on sufficient facts and data.
And are all of those tests used by other forensic scientists in your field?
Yes.
Are they been proven to be reliable?
Yes, they have.
Did you apply them consistently in today's case?
Of course.
So let's talk about that first test you ran. You talked about some fingerprint analysis.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about testing for fingerprints?
So anytime I get a surface that I'm going to test for fingerprints, in this case it was the briefcase, I take this magnetic powder that we have and I dust it over the entirety of the surface. That powder will actually stick to the oils that make up what are known as latent fingerprints. And so then when I take a magnet and get rid of the excess powder, I'm left with a nice little outline that I can then lift and analyze in order to make a conclusion about who it belongs to.
So once you lift those fingerprints, how do you try to match them to a person?
Well, the first thing that I did was I fingerprinted all the suspects in this case and compared against those. Once I made my conclusion, I like to be absolutely sure that I'm right. So I sent it off to the FBI, and they ran it against their APHIS database. Their conclusions backed mine up.
Now, would you recognize that briefcase that you analyzed if I showed it to you today?
Absolutely.
Dr. Sikorsky, is this the briefcase you analyzed?
Yes, it is.
Have you seen this before? Or you
Yes, Your Honor, no objection.
At this time, the people offer Exhibit 1 to evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
Now, Dr. Sikorsky, can you tell us where did you find fingerprints on this briefcase?
Absolutely. So I started out by dusting out the outside, because the inside's made out of felt, and you're not going to find a latent fingerprint on a porous surface like that. So I found one fingerprint, actually two fingerprints on either side of the lid. I found one on the latch and three more on the handle of the briefcase.
Now, Dr. Sikorsky, using these tabs, could you show us where you found each of the fingerprints and to whom they belong?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to use blue to represent Avery Bancroft, because blue and Bancroft start with the same letter. I found Avery Bancroft's index fingerprints right here. One on that side of the lid, the other one right there. I also found one of Avery Bancroft's thumbprints on the right side latch. And I finally found Avery Bancroft's index fingerprint right here on the handle.
Now, what about the fingerprints of Mr. Chase Covington?
Well, I also found two of Chase Covington's fingerprints. They were his ring and middle finger. And I found them right here on the handle as well. There you go.
So what conclusions can you draw from these fingerprint analysis?
Well, the fingerprints themselves tell me two things. They first tell me that both Avery Bancroft and Chase Covington came into contact with this briefcase at some point. Can't tell you when based on the fingerprints, but they definitely both touched it. Also, the fact that there was a thumbprint on this latch leads me to believe that it's more likely than not that at some point Avery Bancroft opened the briefcase.
So I'd like to move on to that second part of your analysis. You mentioned some DNA testing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So when I looked at the inside of the briefcase, I actually found 5 hairs in there. And in order to make a conclusive analysis of who they belong to, I have to use DNA evidence. So I gathered the DNA evidence from them, printed out what's known as a DNA profile, and then I compared it against all the other suspects in this case.
So when you do this analysis, how do you conclude that one piece of DNA matches another person's DNA?
Well, the DNA profile is essentially, it's like a fingerprint for DNA, and we look to see if they match up. I actually brought a demonstrative with me today that I sometimes use to explain in my classes at Midland State.
Permission?
So I can use it?
Yes, permission for the witness to step down and make use of this demonstrative?
Yes, that's fine.
Now, Dr. Sikorsky, what are we looking at right here?
Well, what we've got here is a printout of 4 different DNA profiles. Now, I want to be clear, these are not the actual DNA profiles I used in the case. They're actually going to be a lot more complicated than this. This is just a simplification that I use to teach my classes. But what we're going to do is we first collect DNA from the crime scene. In this case, it was the briefcase, and we obtain a DNA profile for that. The next thing we do is we obtain DNA. In this case, I use what are known as buccal swabs from the inside of someone's cheek to obtain evidence of DNA from someone else. In this case, I used Avery Bancroft, Chase Covington, and Tracy Menetos.
So using Mr. Monster, can you show us how do you match up these samples with suspects?
Absolutely. So each one of these points is a point of comparison on the DNA profile. So if you start out, let's take this point for example. We can automatically rule out this suspect and this suspect based on the fact that they don't have that point in common. Now, with a much longer and more complex DNA profile, we can actually make a positive conclusion that, in this case at least, the crime scene is the same as suspect 2. That's how we do the analysis.
Thank you, Dr. Scorsese. You can retake your seat. So in this case, were you able to find out to whom the hair strands in the briefcase belonged?
Yes, I was.
And who did they belong to?
Well, the strands in the briefcase were a complete match for Avery Bancroft.
And so what can that tell you?
Well, again, that in and of itself can't tell me a whole lot, but what it can tell me is that at some point, Avery Bancroft spent time around the briefcase while it was open, since those were her hairs inside the briefcase.
All right, now I'd like to talk about that third test you ran. You talked about finding a stain inside the briefcase. How exactly did you analyze that stain?
Well, there was a small stain down towards the bottom of the briefcase, and it was immediately obvious to me that it was a fragrance stain because it smelled really powerfully. What I did is I collected a sample of that, and then I ran it through what's known as a gas chromatographer and another test called a mass spectrometer. Now, those two tests give you the mass to charge ratio and the relative abundance, but in common English, it essentially gives you a chemical fingerprint.
And so once you have that chemical fingerprint, how do you match it to something else?
Well, the FBI doesn't have a database of chemicals, so what I have to do in this case is collect other chemicals and compare them in the hopes that I find a match.
So what chemicals did you compare to the stain that you found in the briefcase?
Well, operating under the assumption that it was a fragrance stain, I had my officers collect fragrances from the house of Avery Bancroft and Chase Covington. I then compared these stains, and only one of them was even close to a match, but that match was very conclusive.
And what match was that?
Well, in Avery Bancroft's house, there was a cologne called La Nuit de Warhe, which is a very rare French fragrance, and it was a 95% match.
And so what can the presence of this stain tell you about this briefcase?
Well, it tells me that at some point, Avery Bancroft most likely spilled her cologne inside the briefcase.
Now, with all of these tests that you ran, what conclusions overall can you make about this briefcase?
Well, viewing all of my conclusions together, I first told you that the fingerprints tell us that we know they both handled the briefcase and at some point Avery opened the briefcase. The amount of physical evidence inside the briefcase tells me that Avery Bancroft spent significant time around the briefcase while it was open. Also, the fact that the briefcase was found on Chase Covington at the time of his arrest indicates to me that at some point there was a change of possession.
Thank you, Dr. Sikorsky. No further questions at this time. Would opposing counsel like me to deconstruct the demonstrative?
It's fine, I can take it down. Inquirer, please. Good morning.
Good morning.
You're brought on to analyze a briefcase found in the possession of Chase Covington.
That's correct.
And you did 3 main tests on that briefcase. One of these was a fingerprint analysis test.
Yes, it was.
And you used an ACV procedure on this briefcase.
That's correct.
And you found 6 total fingerprints on it because of that test.
Yeah, they're the ones that I marked here.
But only 2 of those were from Chase Covington.
That's correct. They're the pink ones right here on the handle.
And neither of those fingerprints were on the latch.
Nope.
And that latch is used to unlock the briefcase.
Yes, it is.
So you can't tell us that Chase Covington unlocked that briefcase.
No, I can't. But I also can't tell you he didn't unlock the briefcase. Fingerprints are moved and distorted. All I can tell you is what the evidence shows.
And there's no evidence that shows that Chase Covington opened that briefcase.
Not forensically, no.
And I'd like to talk to you about what this test cannot show you. It cannot show you when those fingerprints were made.
No. Fingerprints do decay slightly over time, but nothing about these fingerprints indicate that they decayed. I couldn't tell you a specific time frame.
But they could have been made a week ago,
Correct.
could have been made a month ago.
It's unlikely. They found it on Chase Covington, but I
Or
can't
it is
tell you.
possible.
It is possible, yes.
They could have been made several months ago, couldn't they?
Possibly, yeah.
All this test can tell you is that Chase Covington picked up the handle of that briefcase.
Yes.
And I'd like to bring you to the second test today, which was the hair analysis test,
Mm-hmm.
and you used a light microscopy test on this, correct?
Yeah, light microscopy was a preliminary test. That my actual conclusions came from the DNA, as light microscopy is kind of considered to be a pseudoscience by a lot of people now.
But you found five hair follicles in that briefcase,
That's correct.
and those were from Avery Bancroft.
Yes, they were.
But once again, that test cannot tell you how those hair follicles got in there,
No, again.
and it can't tell you when they got in there.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's bring you to that third and final test you did, all right?
All right.
That was a chemical composition test,
Yes, it was.
and you used a GCMS test on this.
Yeah, specifically gas chromatography and mass spectrometry.
You found a 1 inch in diameter stain in that,
That's correct.
and you found it to be a fragrance.
Mm-hmm.
A fragrance that was also found in Avery Bancroft's residence.
That's correct. It was La Nuit Noire.
But you can't tell us definitively that the sample found in Avery Bancroft's home was the same as the one in that briefcase.
No, I can't. I want to be clear about this. The cologne in the briefcase, I can't say it was specifically Avery Bancroft's cologne, but it was an incredibly rare kind of cologne that my officers did only find at Avery Bancroft's home.
Thank you for that. Now, I'd like to bring you to what you didn't see in that briefcase when you received it. It was empty, wasn't it?
That's correct, except for the hairs.
And you agree that there could have been anything inside that briefcase,
No, there's a lot of things that if they were in that briefcase would have left evidence.
but there could have been documents in that briefcase, correct?
Quite possibly.
Could have been business documents.
Yeah.
So all your tests can tell you is that at some point, Avery Bancroft and Chase Covington were in possession of that briefcase.
That's correct.
No further questions.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. We ask that Dr. Sikorsky be allowed to step down.
That's fine.